All right, welcome folks. We're just going to let a few of you filter in here. All right. Well, we will get started. Good afternoon, everyone. As folks are filtering in, I'm just going to quickly start by orienting you briefly to the Zoom functionality so you can best navigate the tools on this webinar. I'm sure you're all zoomed out by now, you know the functionality, but we'll just go over it briefly and then I'll go into the flow of the day. So my colleague Megan Fowler and I are your tech supports today. So please feel free to send us a private chat if you're having any technical issues or if you need any further direct support throughout the call. We're keeping everybody on mute today just to keep things a little bit less chaotic. The start video button there, we do encourage you to turn on your video for networking purposes if you're comfortable with that, but no need to if you're not. The participants button there allows you to view a list of all the other participants on the call. And the chat button, this one's really important. We as the moderators will be sharing links and information with you all throughout the day. And so to view it, just click it, a sidebar will pop up. And you can also use a chat box to pose any questions or comments you have throughout the presentation. We're gonna do our best to get to everyone's questions during the Q&A sections later on in the agenda. Notice there's a drop down and that allows you to chat to everyone or privately to an individual. The presentation today is being recorded and we'll make it available on AFT's website along with a resource handout with resources that presenters today will be mentioning. Today we're also going to be running a few polls to gauge where the audience is at and keep you all on your toes. So we're actually going to start right now with the first poll. We just want to get a sense of who's here in the room with us. So just take a minute to fill that out, and as you're filling it out, I'm just gonna say that I wanna really extend a formal welcome to the third webinar of the Farms for the Future project. You're in solar siting and farmland, siting options and considerations. My name is Jamie Pottern. I'm the New England Program Manager here at AFT, and my colleague Emily Cole and I will be your MCs for the next 90 minutes, which is exciting. So we're gonna end the poll here and share these results and to see who's in the room. So really interesting, nice mix of folks. 22% of you are municipal volunteers or staff, 41% land trust volunteer staff, some nonprofit, state agency folks, as well as some solar industry staff and others. So this is really great. This is sort of our intended audience. And so we're so glad you're here and we're really excited to spend this next 90 minutes with you guys. So just a little bit more about this workshop series itself. This series was created through the partnership and really incredible organizing efforts of the following people and organizations. My colleague Megan Fowler and myself at AFT, Stephanie Morningstar from the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. She's here on the call. You can wave, Steph. Meg Quinn from Maine Farmland Trust, Jeremy Luigi from Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire, who's also here on the call. Jeremy's waving. And Nancy Everhart at the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And this project has been generously funded by Jane's Trust. So great group of organizers. And today we're joined by some really wonderful guest speakers who are at the intersection of solar, climate change, and farmland protection efforts in our region. Really great, great suite of folks. So I'm gonna rattle their names off real quick. As I mentioned, Emily Cole from AFT. She's our New England Climate and Ag Program Manager. Jake Marley, who's the Managing Director at Hyperion Systems LLC, Lexi Hain, who's the founder of Agrivoltaic Solutions LLC, Alex Metzger, who's the Stewardship Director at Monadnock Conservancy, and Madeline Minot, who's the Executive Director at Clean Energy New Hampshire. So powerhouse group of folks. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. So really quick, just want to give you a little bit more context to this webinar series. As I mentioned, this webinar is the third in a 5-part series of educational workshops that we have designed specifically for land trusts, municipalities, and other nonprofits and service providers in the state of New Hampshire, as well as the 2 other northern New England states. And really for those who want to better understand how to support farms and farmers in their communities. And especially due to COVID-19, as you all know, there's just this growing interest in local agriculture and a real desire for more skills and training for securing a more resilient food system at the local level, as well as advancing greater land justice. So therefore, each of these workshops has been designed to really offer some core content, some state-specific tools and resources, Q&A, and networking opportunities. And each workshop also builds off of the previous one. And so we really do encourage you, if you haven't been with us the last two, to go back and catch the recordings that are on our website. And we hope you will also join us for the following two in this series. This workshop, the first workshop, did a broad overview of principles and tools for farm-friendly communities. Last week's was more about farm protection tools. This one's about solar siting, and week after next and the week that follows, there'll be one about making farmland available to farmers, and then supporting Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color in your community. So really excited about those, and we'll go over the dates of these and other related upcoming workshops at the end of this presentation. So before we let you hear from our fabulous speakers, I'm just going to quickly run through the agenda. You're going to first hear from Emily Cole, my colleague, who's going to share her extensive knowledge on the landscape of solar siting on farmland in New England and AFT's position and work in this space, as well as some best practices and approaches. Madeline Minot is going to provide an overview of some land use and siting policies in New Hampshire. Esther's going to talk about solar options on conserved land. We'll then have a Q&A with the two of them, followed by a presentation from Jake Marley, and as well as hearing from Lexi Hain about the benefits of solar grazing. And then we're going to wrap up with sharing some upcoming workshops, as I said, and then we're going to try to end by 3:30. So we have a lot to pack in, and therefore, without further ado, I'm going to hand you off to my colleague, Emily. Thanks, Em.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks everybody for being here today and joining us as we explore what we can do in New Hampshire with solar and with farmland to try to move both forward, protect our farmland, and try to meet some clean energy goals while we do it. So I am the Climate and Agriculture Program Manager for New England, and as part of my work here at AFT, I really dove headfirst into this issue and this sort of land use discussion and sometimes conflict between farmland and solar. And I've gotten a few questions as to why is AFT at the table and why is AFT in this conversation. So I'd like to take a moment to answer that, because I think it's important why we're here, and we hope that other conservation organizations will join us at the table. Go ahead and move to the next one. So when we're thinking about solar siting as an organization, it's certainly very much secondary to farmland protection. And if we just, held firm with 100% agriculture, no solar, we would be up at the top of this spectrum arrow where it says status quo. Asterisk is there for a moment. I'll come back to that. And if we, took ourselves out of the conversation and we had significant development without conservation organizations at the table, we would see significant farmland loss. However, let's go back to the asterisk. Status quo isn't really status quo. We wouldn't keep all of the productive farmland that we currently have right now. We would be losing it for other reasons. We would lose it to residential development. We would lose it to climate change. We would lose the actual productivity of our lands. So neither end of this spectrum is really where we think we can make headway and meet some needs of both our farmers, of farmland protection, and of climate change. And so we've inserted ourselves into the middle, and we are working on developing policies and programs and advocating for smart solar siting. And that's really where we can protect our most productive ag lands, we can protect our natural and working lands. Simultaneously, we are exploring the compatible ways in which solar can be sited on farmland and can serve multiple purposes. Go ahead, Megan. And so I think it sums it up in the sort of orange text underneath the cattle grazing over there. That's at the UMass Research Farm. In the background, you can see some of the solar panels. So to maximize potential renewable energy while minimizing impact on the nation's most productive farmland and other resources. As an organization, we are very much aware we need to meet climate goals. We are doing that in our own work around really trying to support and encourage better farming practices that are climate smart and regenerative. We also are here to support our farmers and make sure that their work can continue on and that they can be viable. So we aren't asking anyone to sacrifice agricultural land. We are trying to advocate for those ideas that can integrate it in the most compatible ways where we can really get more of a win-win situation. And so smart solar siting, it means a lot of slightly different things to a lot of people, and there are different values in that. There are land values, there's climate values, there's clean energy values, and so there's a lot of room in there for discussion onto what that looks like. And really that's part of what we think smart solar siting is. It's getting all of the stakeholders at the table and evaluating your best options to both protect our productive farmland, but also move solar energy forward. Go ahead. So we have developed some in-house guidelines if there is going to be siting of solar on farmland, and we see this as an opportunity for our farmers, and we see this as an opportunity to combat climate change. But we do want to make sure that it progresses with a few key factors in mind. And our mission as AFT is really, it's about the land, it's about the farmers, and it's about the practices. And so when we're talking about solar siting, it's no different. We want to make sure that we are prioritizing the agricultural land. We want productive farmland to maintain its productivity. That does not preclude solar. And solar does not preclude agriculture. It's about the appropriate way to integrate. If we can site on more disturbed or marginal farmland, and marginal has a lot of different ways to describe it as well, but the lands that are less productive on a farmer's acreage, then that's going to be less impactful on their productivity, and those most productive fields can continue. We want to prioritize agriculture, and that really means allowing agriculture to continue on these lands versus full-scale removal from production due to development for other reasons. And solar can be a way to actually maintain the farmland itself. And lastly, prioritizing the farmers and making sure that they're at the table and they're part of the conversation if they are interested in integrating solar into their own operation. So a little more on prioritizing the agriculture aspect of this. A little bit later, you're going to hear about some of the really, I think, interesting and really great opportunities to integrate agriculture into solar. You know, first, if we can get it on brown fields and rooftops and building mounted, that's what we want. But the numbers are out there, and we do not have enough of those preferred sites to support all of the solar we're going to need as a region. So it's going to come to green fields, and if AFT isn't there, it's going to go on farmland without perhaps enough consideration as it should get. So we encourage incentivization of, or incentivizing dual use arrays where you can actually farm in and around the solar panels. Typically they might be an adjusted design, might be raised if you have large cattle, might be raised so you can have machinery and the rows are spread out. But we think that that's an opportunity to improve farm viability with income stream, meet our climate goals, and protect the land. The land itself, thinking about what sort of farmland we want to encourage siting on, ultimately prime farmland is important to us, but we all know that we have a limited amount and we're losing it. We're losing it to either climate change or we're losing it to development. So when it comes down to it, ultimately we just do not want to displace agriculture, period. So we would encourage siting on sort of maybe those wastelands where you have that back 40 with all of the old equipment, or the marginal land. And if that's not the case, what we would really want is to ensure that it's dual use, that's moving forward on the productive farmland. And the most important piece of all of this is the farmers. We talk about the land and we talk about clean energy, but we also need to support our farmers. We know the current situation right now is economically very difficult for quite a few farmers, a large portion of our farming community. And so the opportunity to have solar sited on your farm even if it's small scale, it means it's reducing monthly operating costs, reducing your electricity bill significantly. If it's a larger array, that's added income on top of that. So these are opportunities to diversify income stream. This is an opportunity to support our working farmers. And it also provides them an opportunity to maintain their land and transition it properly, well, properly according to AFT, right? Transition it to the next generation of farmers, which we think is very important. In 2017, AFT first got into the space. We had our first sort of workshop in Connecticut around what is smart solar siting, what does the region need, what do we have in terms of stakeholders that want to be at the table. And so from that, we developed the New England Smart Solar Siting Partnership, which is a collaborative effort between Acadia Center, Vermont Law School's Farm and Energy Institute, Conservation Law Foundation, Vote Solar, and AFT. And for 2 years, we have been working at gathering information, interviewing stakeholders who have interest in this, also interviewing and gathering policies and programs from regional states, and trying to use that information to develop and inform some proposed policies and programs that we think will reduce conflict around siting. Next slide. And so we are nearing the end of those 2 years, and what we have done, which we think is going to be really hopeful, and what we're really hopeful will be helpful for New England, is a set of analyses that we think can guide either the adjustment or the development of solar programming, solar siting, and really trying to open up the discussion to more, I would say, metered and smart solar programming. That includes principles for solar energy development, state-specific land use scenarios. We've actually looked at, what brownfields are available, what farm land is there, what forest land is there, and tried to be very careful about setting up some scenarios that could meet energy needs. Looking at a comparison across the states of what their policies are. We developed our own set of policy strategies for review from states. We looked at different both contaminated land use scenarios and forest and farmland use scenarios. And then we've also done an investigation to what the costs of these are. So ultimately, AFT is here really as a middle ground operative. We are trying to find the way where we can get both benefits. We can get farmland protection, we can keep agriculture, we can keep that land for next generations, we can support our farmers, and we can find the really effective ways to integrate solar that achieve those goals and the clean energy goal as well. So that was a lot of me. So take a break from me and take a moment, and I would like to hear from you, and there's a poll that you'll see in just a moment, what kind of issues that you are seeing in your community. It could be that you're seeing the loss of prime farmland, you're seeing lack of adequate policies that incentivize it. Maybe you're hearing that farmers are being approached and they don't have the resources and they're approaching you for the resources. Or do you have communities that are proactively planning and preparing for this eventuality? So please go ahead and check what you have. And if you have other, I'd love to see what it is in the chat box. Wow, okay, so 71% of our answers here are lack of adequate policies that incentivize smart solar. That's really interesting, very different from yesterday's, and that's great. And we'll hear a little more about the incentivization program, SMART program in Mass, that does have some adders that can help move solar where you want it to. So hopefully we'll learn some tips and tricks today from the other states that can maybe help move New Hampshire where we want it to go. Great. So what I would like to do now is start to move into the New Hampshire experts that we have on our panel today. And that is going to start with Madeline Minot. She's the Executive Director of Clean Energy New Hampshire. And she is really going to help us understand the landscape of solar in New Hampshire a little bit better. And so I'm going to hand it off to you, Madeline. And thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. I'm happy to be here with you all today. I'll just start a little bit by telling you about our organization, Clean Energy New Hampshire. We're a nonprofit organization based here in New Hampshire, and we're focused entirely on doing work in New Hampshire. And we work on advancing renewable energy, energy efficiency, and clean tech through education, policy, and advocacy. We are a membership-based organization, and we have individual, business, and municipal/governmental members. So we work a lot on policy, both at the State House and the Public Utilities Commission. For our business members, we act a little bit like a trade association, even though we are a 501c3. And we do a lot of technical assistance with energy committees and municipal staff. So that's a little bit the background, and we work on lots of other things, but I'll leave it at there. So next slide, please. So a little bit of background, what's the landscape for solar currently in New Hampshire? What stands out is that New Hampshire lags far behind in installed solar and current solar development compared to other New England states. The table here shows the PV photovoltaic forecast from ISO New England. So how much installed solar capacity there is in every New England state and what it's projected to be by 2029. So for the next 10 years, New Hampshire has just a little over 100 megawatts of total installed solar capacity. That's everything, right? From a small system on somebody's roof to the largest array in the state. And that represents roughly 1% of, that would generate roughly 1% of all the electricity that's used in New Hampshire. When you look at some of our neighbors like Massachusetts and Vermont, they have over 10% of the energy they used already installed and generated by solar. Maine is also pretty low in this table, but because of some recent changes in policy, they're experiencing a solar boom. So they're projected to catch up and see a lot more development. So as the projection goes, New Hampshire is not really, under current policies, unless something changes, expected to see the solar development pressure that our New England neighbors is seeing. Next slide, please. So where is solar development heading currently in New Hampshire? Mostly we have what I would call fairly small solar systems installed. The biggest solar array in the state currently is at 3.1 megawatts. Located in Merrimack, there's a 2 megawatt array in Moultonborough, but really we're not seeing anything very large currently. That's in part because of the existing net metering policy, which caps the eligibility to participate in net metering or group net metering at 1 megawatt of capacity. We are, however, seeing increased interest in developing what I would call utility scale solar developments. So we're seeing sort of a bifurcation. It's either small or it's very large. So currently the first solar project is seeking approval at our site evaluation committee in New Hampshire. That's the statewide siting body, which you have to go to if you are 30 megawatts or more. And so that's Chinook Solar, located in Fitzwilliam, being developed by Nextera. We have quite a few other projects that are 10 megawatts, 30 megawatts. We have some of our members looking at even bigger developments elsewhere in the state. Most of these projects are being developed because they've won bids in other New England states' clean energy procurements. So our southern neighbors, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, have issued requests for proposals to acquire solar power. But those projects don't have to be sited within state. So because New Hampshire doesn't have as much solar developed already, there is more opportunity, there's more space, there's more interconnection opportunity. So once you've already had a lot of solar developed, it becomes more expensive. There's more infrastructure upgrades needed to connect to the grid. That's not the case here. And so that's attracting some of this development pressure for larger utility scale projects. Most of the large projects I've seen are mostly on formerly logged or formerly logged sites, but there is a few that are also considered on agricultural areas. Next slide. There are already a few existing conflicts, even though we've had low development pressure. Both at the local level and at the state level, there's a lot of current consideration about how to define solar in terms of impervious cover, stormwater management, and what should be considered the disturbed project area. We're seeing towns working on developing solar-specific zoning and planning regulations. Our organization has developed a model solar zoning ordinance that a lot of towns and energy committees have used as the basis to develop their own regulations. So we've worked with a lot of towns on advancing those. We're also seeing a lot of NIMBYism, where even in some really progressive towns, people say solar's nice in theory, but we don't want to see it. So that's something that we wrestle with all the time. Next slide. So New Hampshire policies that influence solar development. I already mentioned that net metering, currently project eligibility is capped at 1 megawatt. So we see a lot of projects going up to that. Some of that is on rooftops. There was a picture of Dover High School before, Worthing Industry in Nashua, Filtrine in Keene. So there are some really large buildings that have arrays that approach a megawatt in capacity. Some of those are ground mounted. Our renewable portfolio standard is not ambitious at all in New Hampshire. The goal is to source 0.7% of our energy from solar by 2025. And as I mentioned, we already have about 1%. So we've already exceeded our goal 5 years early, which means that the value of renewable energy certificates is very, very low. So there's already an oversupply of solar as far relative to our goal for the state, which makes the value of commodities like renewable energy certificates more challenging. There's also no existing siting incentive policy, so I wasn't surprised to see the result of the poll, as opposed to Massachusetts, which has had very focused programs to encourage the development of solar on landfill, on capped landfills, for example, or on brownfields. We don't have that currently in New Hampshire. In a former net metering docket at the Public Utilities Commission, our organization tried to advocate for locational adders. So adding additional compensation to encourage the development on certain sites, certain land uses, or away from certain land uses. But unfortunately, we were not successful in enacting such a policy. But it's something we continue to be very interested in. And something that's important to keep in mind is that the economics of solar in New Hampshire are very challenging. The compensation is not what it is in our neighboring states, either through programs like SMART or net metering or a feed-in tariff that we've seen in other states. And as I mentioned, the value of renewable energy certificates is also very low and very uncertain. So that drives a lot of where and how solar development in New Hampshire is happening. As I mentioned, we're seeing more and more interest on the really large projects, and that's because you pretty much have to use economies of scale to make the projects pencil out. As far as more specific to solar and agriculture, we are seeing some examples of, I'd say, the smaller examples of co-uses. The picture here is from Beach Hill Farm in Hopkinton. And on their little sign, it says, "We run completely on solar power." And they're a great example. My kids love to go get ice cream there and go through their corn mazes. And they have a combination of roof mounted and ground mounted solar that powers their entire operations, which is really nice. There's also Sullivan Farm in Nashua, which just completed a conservation easement. They have a few large ground mounted trackers, and they're planning on adding more to at least supply all the energy they need on site. We're seeing some interest in larger dual uses developments. Here in Concord, there was quite a bit of conversation about solar zoning ordinance, and we saw quite a few local farmers come out and say, for example, Lewis Farm, that they were very interested in developing a significant amount of solar, and at least some of them intended for it to be dual uses, continuing to actively farm the land where the solar would also be located. So there's definitely interest. And I think that's all I have for now. I'd be happy to take questions once we get there.
Thank you, Madeline. Excuse me. Thanks, Madeline. We'll move to Alex in just a moment, and then we will open it up for questions to both Madeline and Alex. So if you have them, save them. We'll come right back to both speakers for that. So next up is Alex Metker from the Monadnock Conservancy, who is the stewardship director there, going to talk to us a little more about how solar can be compatible with our conserved farmlands. Take it away, Alex.
Hey, thanks very much, Emily. And yeah, I was really excited to be a part of this because our organization is kind of just really starting to get into this discussion of how to essentially make conservation easements and solar more compatible. Because it has been done, but in kind of our recent efforts, we've actually received a couple of requests recently and run into some challenges with that. We definitely have some more work to do in kind of figuring out how to make it more possible. So I know there's a lot of other land trust folks who are tuned in today, and hopefully either in the kind of questions and comments section later, or even later offline, I'd be happy to connect with people and kind of talk more about things. But these are the purpose. You can switch slides. So basically, the purpose of my talk is to kind of introduce some of the basic elements of conservation easements in order to ensure everybody has kind of a baseline of knowledge of the things that are directly relevant to solar on easements. Talk about our recent requests as kind of a case study and some of the challenges that it identified with putting solar on conservation easements. And then, forward to some of the opportunities we identified, and, using this as more kind of a general call for creative thinking about how to make this more possible, how to get more solar out there in a way that kind of avoids some of the legal challenges we've run into. Okay, and then go ahead. So a conservation easement in the very, very basic form, it's a permanent legal restriction on a piece of land. So it kind of lays out the legal requirements for how the land has to be managed and protected, as well as how it can be used. And so kind of three main parts of this that relate to solar are the conservation purposes. So why was the easement established in the first place? Is it to protect, oftentimes it's to protect a working farm. And so the working farmland in the forest that goes along with that can be to protect other ecological values and habitat, wetlands, things like that. One thing that it typically restricts is commercial activity on the property. So for our easements, it's typically limited to agriculture or forestry as commercial activity on the property. And this factors in later. And it also typically restricts structures. So what types of structures can be put on, and oftentimes where they can be added to the property. And these often are only allowed to be structures that are directly related to a commercial activity that's allowed, or a conservation purpose of the easement. So that's kind of basically the framework that we're working within. Something important to note about conservation easements is that they allow the landowner sometimes a pretty significant tax deduction on their land because they have charitable contribution status through the IRS. And if the IRS considers that there's a personal benefit from the property, financial or otherwise, that doesn't relate to the conservation purposes or the allowed commercial activities, they're essentially allowed to take away the charitable contribution status of that property. And so that's something that we constantly have to be considering when we make decisions about what to allow on the property and what not to allow. So some of the key players, obviously the landowners being the owners and operators of the land and the managers. Us as the land trust, our role is really, as holders of the easement, is to ensure that all of the terms of the easement are being upheld, and that there's nothing going on that doesn't fit the terms of the easement. Kind of looking over our shoulder on that is the Attorney General's office and the IRS, to ensure that everything's kind of legally and financially sound. We're lucky in New Hampshire that we have a charitable trust unit within our Attorney General's office. So in our state, we're able to get oftentimes some a lot more nuanced advice on how the IRS and the AG are going to react to certain things that we would like to put into the easement or easement amendments, anything like that. So we're often able to get pretty good advice on these types of things. And I would say we also have a responsibility to the general public and as a conservation organization in trying to deal with things like climate change and in trying to figure out creative ways to ensure that we can, you know, get the renewable energy that we need out there, and that we're trying to figure out creative solutions rather than being an obstacle. Okay, and onward. So just quickly going over these requests, that you see the map on the left. This is the map of the land of the landowner who wanted to build a solar installation in the recently hayed field that you see kind of in the middle of the photo. They wanted to build a solar installation there, connect it to the barn and connect it to their house and to the grid and to take advantage of net metering. You know, and all of this makes complete sense. This is kind of how you would do it. But right away, when we were trying to determine whether this request met the requirements of the easement, we ran into three major obstacles. So first, it's possible that the IRS could see taking advantage of net metering for a solar installation on the easement as a private benefit issue. So essentially, if you're producing energy on a conservation easement that is not, and you're selling energy to the grid, essentially, you're receiving some money for it, and it's not related to one of the commercial purposes laid out in this easement, it could be seen by the IRS as a conflict, as a private benefit issue. So that's kind of the first obstacle that we ran into. The second being the way they were proposing it was built, it would involve building a new structure on the property that wasn't, you know, as we say in our conservation easement language, necessary in the accomplishment of one of the commercial purposes or one of the conservation purposes. And so this is where we saw that the Attorney General would also might raise some flags. And then third, but probably, you know, a little bit less so, there would have been a little bit of impact to the acreage of working agricultural land, which we still have to take seriously, since it was considered one of the main purposes of this easement was to ensure that it continued to be working agricultural land, as it's one of the few places in the state that has prime agricultural soils. So these are kind of the obstacles we ran into first, that we realized before we give approval for anything like this, we need to figure out how to creatively address some of these issues, or you know. And so essentially jumping down to the risk. So knowing that these issues exist and going ahead instead and allowing the construction of solar panels on the easement presents a risk to both the landowners and to us as an organization. It could result in the charitable contribution status of the property being revoked and the landowner losing the tax deduction that they're getting for that property, you know, making the financial situation worse for them. And it could affect our standing with the Attorney General and the IRS as a land trust if we're allowing people to do things that they deem are not allowed by the easement. So obviously there's some problem solving to do to get around some of these legal obstacles. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And so some of the, I guess, first things we identified that we would have to do in order to get around some of these would be for older easements. It's worth noting that once the easement is written, it is very difficult to change. And a lot of these easements were written back in a time when we weren't necessarily thinking about solar being a big part of keeping agriculture viable, and in solar being, you know, a more available and abundant thing for landowners. And so most of our easements, especially the older ones, are completely silent as far as solar goes, and this has presented some challenges. Some of the solution to these, obviously with siting, if the array could be located in an area excluded from the easement that's still on the property, but is not part of the conservation easement, that would be one way to get around all of these issues, because then it would be completely outside the purview of the conservation easement and any of the entities who are making sure that it's upheld. So that's kind of the obvious answer. Putting it on existing rooftops or the rooftops of existing structures, of allowed structures on the property, is another option, because that gets around the limitation around structures, you know, having to be directly related to the allowed commercial uses. And I'm sure there are other solutions out there. So I'm hoping that, you know, again, we're kind of just starting to get into this issue. So I'm hoping to hear some more creative solutions from folks here and then elsewhere as well. Another thing we ran into was sizing. So to get around the personal benefit issue, it would be possible to size the solar panels and the output so that they're more equal to just the amount that's going to be used. And this is not ideal, because it would mean that you're not taking advantage of net metering. And so that, you know, sizing it to be only as big as what's going to be used is obviously not an ideal solution. So hopefully there's another solution around that. And then if solar panels are going to be located on the easement, connecting it only to uses and structures that are specifically approved by the easement. So unfortunately, that would mean not being able to connect it to a private residence. Again, this is an obstacle that, you know, I imagine others in the community, in the land trust community, have run into, and that we need to kind of work together to try to figure out other solutions. In terms of new easements, the way we craft new easements, we're kind of taking some forward-thinking action to be able to better incorporate solar. One of them is just planning ahead as far as exclusion areas go. So if it's possible that a landowner is going to want to install solar in the future, talking about that up front and maybe having an exclusion area that's large enough and that's in the right location to be able to install solar on the property still. That's one of kind of the easiest solutions to some of the obstacles we ran into. And then adding, in our later conservation easements, we've been adding in language specifically about solar. And even in one of our older easements that we're amending, we're going to try to add in language about solar to kind of guide essentially where it can be put, how big it can be, in order that the IRS and the AG's office know that we're, you know, abiding by the restrictions that they're kind of imposing. So, you know, obviously, again, this is kind of the starting point. It looks a little bit grim right now, but I'm confident that we can figure out some ways to more creatively incorporate solar onto properties. You know, I'm not sure where this has gotten, but I've heard talk about kind of almost re-envisioning solar as you know, harvesting of the sun in order to be able to situate it on agricultural land. And with that, you know, I'm not sure how far that strategy has gotten. I think maybe, I believe folks from the Sports Society may be able to speak more toward that, being a little bit more experienced in this area. But anyway, that's basically what I have. And I look forward to, you can switch to the last slide. I look forward to talking with folks here, and feel free to take a screenshot of this and contact me offline. We're still trying to learn more, and you know, hopefully we can have some good discussions that kind of move things forward.
Thank you, Alex. Really appreciate the New Hampshire and the conserved input on what's happening and what's possible and what's tricky. It's a question a lot of people are facing around solar these days. We're starting to get a few questions in the chat box. Please, anyone else that has questions, please go ahead and put them in. But I am going to ask the first one of Madeline, I guess maybe also Alex, if you know. Are there grant programs out there and available for startup costs for solar that might help with the costs for farmers who want to install, even if it's a smaller array?
Yeah, definitely. At the federal level, the USDA Rural Development Program has energy-specific grants. You can apply for a grant for solar or even for energy efficiency upgrades. So that's definitely the one I would recommend looking into for any farms that might be interested in installing solar. At the state level, we have a solar rebate program. So depending on the size of the system we're talking about, if they were just going to put it on the farmhouse, there's a residential solar rebate. And there's also commercial industrial sized solar rebate. It also might have to do with what kind of meter and what kind of account they have with their utility. So there are established state rebate programs that you apply for through the Public Utilities Commission for different size systems.
That's great. And that's something that the PUC site is probably something that we can track down and add to our resources page for people that are interested in learning more about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share it with you, or anyone can get in touch with our organization as well, and we answer lots of questions about those.
Great. Next, well, actually, Alex, do you know of any grants that farmers are working for farm energy that work with with conserved land?
Not beyond the one that Madeline mentioned.
Okay.
No, I'd like to know of some more though, if anybody else knows.
Like to see a lot more.
Yeah.
Great. So next question, it was also a follow-up from Whitney. This would be for Alex. Could you provide a written example of an easement or the appropriate language around solar, perhaps some of that you've been working on in your newer easements?
Yeah, I'd be happy to kind of, send anybody who's interested the language we have in place and kind of where it's at. We've been pretty recently working to update it, beyond what we've had, because what we have right now, is, I feel it's not sufficient. And, I think we need to have more conversations with some of the other land trusts in the area who've also been dealing with these issues and kind of together come up with a better way to write some of this. Essentially what we're, the way we're writing it is following, some of those citing examples that I mentioned above, about, I guess a lot of times we've had to establish impervious surface limits when it comes to structures. So they're kind of subject to an impervious surface limit, oftentimes a building envelope. So we have to kind of designate the area where new structures are allowed to be built. The sizing of solar is something that we have had to include as well. And that's one of the things that obviously people who want to see more solar, for some of these people, it's very not, it's not ideal to have to limit the sizing of the solar, which kind of limits its net metering potential. So that's kind of one of the big obstacles. But yeah, for anybody interested, if my email could be kind of distributed out there, I'd be happy to send, some example language of the type of thing we use.
Thank you. We have time for a few more questions. So the next is, excuse me, what's the difference between co-use and dual use? And I think that will probably be something that we can dive in even more deeper later on with our next two speakers. But I don't know if you're referring to co-location and dual use, or if co-use is meaning something else. I just need a little clarity on that. So when I wait till hear that, how about we move on to the next one, which would be if the panels were on that farm and the installation was sized to meet the total annual needs, would it still be considered a commercial use, even if there was no net sale of power?
So I'll provide maybe a little bit different perspective than what Alex said. I would like to disagree that if a farm were to right size a solar installation to meet their total annual need, they would still probably want to use net metering, because they're probably not meeting their need in real time, right? They might produce more in the summer and then they get a credit on their bill, which is not a payment. And then they can use that credit in winter months, for example. on an annual basis, you can participate in net metering and never receive a credit that is taxable by the IRS. And so I'm not familiar with the details of the easement restrictions, but that is generally not considered income, and it is not considered a payment or a profit in any way, right? There's a credit on your bill that you can use. That's different from actually receiving a payment. If you are a group net metering host, and you're actually providing credits to an offsite account, and then you are receiving a payment, that's a different situation. So there are different ways of participating in net metering that I think may or may not be considered an enterprise activity where you are actually receiving payment.
Thanks, Madeline. That you know, not being, you know, an expert by any means or even very well versed in this area, that's really helpful. We should probably talk more offline about
Definitely.
more about it.
Connections being made, it's great. I think we have time for one, maybe two more. Here is one likely for Madeline. What is the likelihood the PUC docket on locational enhancements can be reopened?
So the net metering docket, which set new rates and tariffs for the net metering program in New Hampshire, is closed. There are some follow-up studies, so there is likely to be future net metering modifications coming up. We just finished updating the rules, but honestly, likely if someone was really interested in developing a locational incentive program to either encourage development on certain land use types or discourage development on certain land use types, legislation would probably be really helpful to actually directly direct the Public Utilities Commission to develop such a program or such an incentive.
Thank you, great. All right, last one, and I think then we're going to have to move forward. If there's any burning questions that we didn't get to answer, we can absolutely try to continue answering them offline. All right, so for ag folks, do you see opportunities for land trusts to improve their work with farmers around solar, given the limitations that Alex highlighted? If you don't mind, I'm going to take a moment for this one first, and then Alex, if you want to add anything, please do. I see an opportunity for land trusts to be a resource of information, especially when there is not a large flow of information. And so land trusts with siting guidelines, with tips and tricks of what farmers would really need to be prepared for in each individual state if this were something they wanted to pursue is really helpful. That's something that AFT is working on. I know there's lots of other land trusts that are trying to be that resource and work in the solar and farmland connectivity, like Alex is working in trying to build solar into the new easements. And so I think land trusts can really step up and fill this service provider role in terms of how do you investigate solar and its compatibility and its usefulness on each farm.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree with that. Similarly to how we do with other land uses, we tend to try to give the landowner as much advice as we can and connect them to the right experts. And so I'd love to, be able to have, the names of some experts and some basic information that I could pass on to landowners, because this is going to be, it's not been a huge, it hasn't been a huge informational need for us yet when it comes to landowners, but maybe we should probably try to get ahead of it and kind of get the word out there a little bit more with our landowners. So.
Yeah, absolutely. If we can get ahead of the curve, then we can get better sited solar, and we can get farms that can, take advantage of the clean energy and the cost savings. Thanks both to Madeline and Alex and to your great questions. And now we're going to move on to our next section, which is going to be Jake Marley of Hyperion Systems and then Lexi Hain of the, so Lexi has a couple of hats, but she's Agrivoltaic Solutions, and she's also founder of the American Solar Grazing Association. These are going to be two really interesting views and ways to use solar and integrate solar both economically and in terms of environmental benefits. So first we're going to get a quick video from Jake because he was gracious enough to be on all of our workshops this week. We only made him record it once, and then he'll be available for Q&A with Lexi after her presentation.
Hi, my name is Jake Marley. I'm the Managing Director of Hyperion Systems. I want to first start by thanking American Farmland Trust for this opportunity to present today on dual-use solar. And Dr. Michael Lehan, also from Hyperion, will be presenting with me as well. Hyperion Systems was started in 2009 with the belief of food first, then energy. At the core of this hypothetical proposition was that there's a more efficient way to use land than converting it strictly to energy generation, taking it out of agricultural production. This hypothesis was cast if the solar modules are designed specifically to meet the farm's needs, a parcel of land could be used for both energy generation and food production. Hyperion has been funded by NREL as a research partner on the INSPIRE project since 2016. NREL, which stands for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, is a DOE agency which is focused on renewable energy optimization systems. The INSPIRE project, its principal investigator is Jordan Macknick. Hyperion's role within the INSPIRE research effort has been multifaceted, primarily focusing on dual-use economic development, physical project development, and concept dissemination. There are currently 20 different project sites, as you can see in the map in the upper right-hand corner. Other markets are also considering dual-use development, primarily Europe and Asia. Countries like France, Germany, and Italy are building larger scale, community scale solar projects, as well as in Asia, China, and Japan, building community shared or utility scale dual-use solar projects. And now we'll transition to Dr. Michael Lehan to take a closer look at the economic tool that Hyperion has created for the INSPIRE project.
Thank you for the introduction, Jake. This is a snapshot of a segment of the model that Hyperion created with NREL support. The intent of the model is to show a farmer all of the information that they need in one place to make a decision about a long-term capital investment. This example is a 250 kW system. The farmer owns it, and they get smart incentives. Now let's look at the full spreadsheet so that you can see how complete and how thorough and what the overview is. Here's a snapshot of, I will just quickly scroll through the full model so that you can see what the intent, what the scope, and how useful it is, the depth, and the completeness. The original intent was to compare farmland with no solar, with a traditional solar array, and with a dual use or co-location solar array. We then added in tax efficient and tax inefficient. The farmer may or may not care about that, but the capital markets who are funding this do care about it. So at the end of the day, the farmer does care about it. This is the overview of a comparison of the various scenarios. And if you look at scenario B, you can see that the total benefits in terms of cash flow are greater than the other benefits for a variety. You're basically getting an electricity crop and you're getting a slightly diminished agricultural crop at the same time. So this is the top of it. There are, and why won't you move? There's a graphic representation of it. Here are the assumptions and the data entry. The colored cells you enter data in, the rest are calculated, and it shows all of the capital costs so that the farmer can deal effectively with the developer, with the installer, with the financer. All of the information is there. And then finally, what we come down to is some cost-benefit analysis, which compares the revenue streams for the next 20 years. So here is everything in about 8 lines, and if they want further details, they'll go back to the larger models that we just showed you. Now I'm going to hand it back to Jake. He can talk about the impacts and the full effects of this very important work that we're doing for NREL and for farmers.
So now that we've gone through some of the economic theory, I wanted to get into the reality and what our experience has been with meeting with several different farmers, different types of producers in Massachusetts and in the Northeast region. Of course, all farmers are different and require unique solutions, but in general, farmers are more likely to invest in operating costs that will produce or increase their revenues rather than investing in new infrastructure. This leads quickly to the discussion or conversation about project costs and what is the best use of capital. Do I want to borrow funds, or is there another type of project ownership that will be better suited for the farmer? And in our experience, they're more likely to look into leasing or a power purchasing agreement rather than owning it outright, and would rather, again, use those revenues to invest back into the farming operation. So you might be asking yourself, what does this project development process look like compared to traditionally installed solar? Hyperion has been working with a Western Mass farmer in Amherst for about the last 8 months to develop a dual-use array on his field that currently produces squash. This field is subject to conservation, which is APR, Agricultural Preservation Restriction, and that is enforced by the Mass Department of Ag Resources. This particular grower is a third-generation steward of the land. He's an industry leader and innovator, which is part of the reason we approached him. The timeline is a key takeaway that for developers and for landowners, because this farmer has been very generous with his time in developing this project. He's viewing this long-term, that this is a really truly innovative project and can be pioneering for not just chicken production, but for other farmers in the Western Mass area. That timeline with the predetermination application, again, increases the overall project development by about 3 or 4 months. There is room to work for solar development. As we mentioned, this land is subject to conservation, and of course that's the focus of this webinar series. There are limitations to behind-the-meter limitations, and then also impervious surface of the overall land. So we've had to work within those, but are in the process of doing that with Mass Department of Ag Resources and Clean Energy Extension. And then the other key takeaway is the dual use adder allows for additional benefits to directly help the farmer. Some of those would be for the chicken production. We're enhancing the fencing security around the array. There will be a water delivery system that's free to the farmer, and then also an increased per acre lease payment. And of course, that's a revenue diversification for the farmer, which is really key in an inherently risky business, as we've seen, especially this year. Thank you for your attention to our presentation. Thank you again to American Farmland Trust for the opportunity to present what we've been working on and our findings thus far. And we would be happy to follow up. You can see our contact information below. Thank you.
That's great. So we will move from the economics, which is so important, next to go to Lexi, who's going to talk about other opportunities around different management strategies that can also be economically viable for more folks. So thanks, Lexi, for being here today. And then after Lexi's presentation, we will open it up for Q&A to both Lexi and Jake. Take it away, Lexi.
Thank you so much, Emily. How's the sound okay?
You're good.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me, American Farmland Trust. And in terms of, so today I will talk about a specific thing that honestly I fell into a few years ago and kind of have been running with it ever since. We'll be talking about solar grazing and primarily with sheep. Here today, I'll be, I'll explain very quickly. I have a farm here in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes. I have a grazing business. I bring my sheep to solar arrays and manage vegetation with them. And in so doing that, starting about 4 years ago, I realized that we needed an association because there needed to be a place where that held knowledge and information about this, and also did outreach. So here I am today. Thank you. Next slide. So loosely, what is solar grazing? It is using livestock to manage the vegetation on the solar arrays. And as you very well will understand, in New Hampshire, it is quite necessary to think of this step. What has happened, or what happened a little bit, I think, is that solar industry professionals have so much to do actually getting it all done that maybe, at least initially, there's not always full thought around the vegetation management at the solar sites. This particular site is in New Jersey and is managed year-round managed by a flock of sheep, and has been managed this way for, I think, at least 4 years by a member of our group. And this is, if you can look at the silver line up the right side, that is, those are single axis trackers, so the panels do move. Next slide, please. And so, you know, why is vegetation management so important and shouldn't be an afterthought? You know, we need that sunshine in order to make that electricity crop grow, as an earlier speaker pointed out. So the photo on the left, where it's just a lot of goldenrod, is what happens if you sort of abandon a solar site for, say, a year or two in a field in New England. And the photo on the right is the other thing that might happen when maybe there isn't an appropriate budget for managing the solar vegetation. And so I call the things in between, the spaces in between the panels, the alleys. And in many cases, especially in a flatter solar array like this, you can get some form of maybe tractor mounted mower or traditional mower up and down the alleys, but it is underneath the panels that provide quite a challenge in many cases for management, which is part of how solar grazing, I think, probably has been, you know, something that is not just a one-off that I do, but it is something that originated in Europe, from what I can figure out, and was considered to be a compatible land use in England, Scotland, Germany, and then it has also been brought here. At this point, I think has been in places like North Carolina at scale for nearly almost 10 years. Next slide, please. Yes, and the key piece here is that, you know, there's not a giant modification needed to accommodate your average flock of grazing sheep. They are like inherently compatible. So this photo here is taken just west of Albany, New York this summer. The sheep are smart enough to duck under where they need to duck under. I currently work on solar sites where the panel height is sometimes as high as 7 or 8 feet at the bottom edge. In other cases, it's down to 18 inches or less. So that can present interesting management challenges. And I do it with sheep, and the sheep have a really nice co-benefit in that if you are managing sheep on pasture, traditionally, you know, sometimes it's hard to find them shade, but in this case, no one has to compete. Next slide, please. So for coming here today, I just wanted to share that I know there's a small amount of solar in New Hampshire and more proposed, and certainly more happening in some of your neighboring states, but the reason that ASGA exists in part is to help those farmers know that they have an opportunity to do things like have that conversation with the solar developer during the permitting process to say, well, why don't we make some accommodations that's going to make this site a little more grazing friendly? Let's talk about a pasture blend that's going to help be very nutritious for my sheep, but also low growing. And let's talk about the fencing that is going to exclude predators, but keep my sheep flocks safe. So these are all three people who are also founding board members of ASGA and do this at least part-time, if not very full-time. Next slide, please. And to be clear, we all do charge for these services. There's coming up. There's information on our website, but it is absolutely essential to charge for the services. In this case, this farmer in Pennsylvania, another one of our members, has to bring her sheep. I think it's like 10 or 15 miles, but still has to bring her sheep to this solar site at Susquehanna University. She has to do the work of managing the sheep within a solar array. She's signed a contract that she's going to provide comprehensive, complete vegetation maintenance, and there won't be shade on those panels. She has to check water, she has to check her minerals. So, she derives now a new income stream from this. And in that case of this, she's got a partner who's willing to work with her year after year. And she's been able to actually expand her flock, which is terrific. Next slide, please. This is another solar grazer who's been, sorry, that's my herding dog. This is another solar grazer partner who first started out as someone with a passion for herding dogs, actually, and has expanded into a full-time business and produces something like 700 lambs a year for the markets in New Jersey. So she's very well located for that. And she also works on more of these tracker sites, which, as you can see from the quick snapshot up there, would be otherwise quite challenging to manage with mowers. Next slide, please. This is actually my solar grazing business and agrivoltaic solutions. This is one of the sites that we've been managing now. It's our third year. It's on the left, it's broken into two sections. On the left, there is a permanent exterior fence. As on the right, it's about 2.5 acres on the left and a little more than 30 acres on the right. I subdivide the site every year, or I subdivide the site and then I rotate the sheep throughout the different paneled areas in roughly 6-acre chunks. I've installed handling system. In that case, it was temporary, but now I have another handling system I use on the site to check the flock throughout the season. And, it actually works it's working as a business, and we're expanding our flock. Next slide, please. Just to give you also a sense of the scale, I mean, the first ones I showed you are all sites that are, direct generation sites. So they're 50 acres and less. But just know that around the world, and I especially included this slide because it's of a solar array in South America called La Quinta, where it is managed with sheep. I believe it's about 450 acres. They have a long-term contract, which is also something I really recommend. Lots of permanent interior fencing to manage the grazing inside the array. So the farmer can really plan, because once you're at a 450 acre array and you're a farmer, you really have to plan for managing that many sheep. And just a last comment on there, you do not see much, there's not been a quantitative study yet that I know of, but you do not see much in the way of reduction of productivity of the pasture as a result. And there's a bunch of details there, but this is just an overview for you. Next slide, please. You can go to our website to look a little bit more, but there's one publicly available information source here. It is a study that we did with Cornell, a couple folks at Cornell, and it basically surveyed people in the East to look at income for the grazers and to look at their costs. So you can see a little bit of information there. Just quickly, the reason the costs are probably, and the income is probably higher in New York State, is that at the time we had only the smaller sites. There were no utility scale sites surveyed. Next slide. And I have a few more here. I can kind of zip through because I'm probably at time. But just showing you some of the management that happens at these different solar sites. And to note that this is something, when you are working with townspeople and developers, that you've got to be allowed to do this stuff. You've got to be allowed to collect your sheep, put in interior fencing, or perhaps the solar firm would be willing to put in interior fencing, which is something I am now seeing, which is wonderful. Next slide. Water is probably the last. It's been a very dry year here in upstate New York. I've spent a lot of time hauling water. It is something that if you are planning as a townsperson or a land trust, make sure that water is something that's available to your solar grazers, if that's something, and I saw it on Jake's study, that was included. There's also a quick fence picture to say the fences really have to be predator proof. Okay, and lastly, this is just a snapshot of our work. Please encourage people to join our association. We have done all kinds of things, such as created a solar grazing map so that you can put your farm business on the map and help match make with solar developers. We've created a seed mix that can be adjusted for your region and climate that is suitable for pollinators and sheep. And we're doing free monthly calls, including one tonight, to help build the knowledge base around solar grazing. So next slide, please. Okay. Thank you. I didn't want to go
we
too
put a
much.
couple upcoming events at the end, but Lexi, do you want to say a couple of things that are coming up on your schedule?
Sure. Do we have the slides or not?
I think they're going to go out as a package at the end. I put up this one.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much. Just an additional economic study has been done with a partner organization in Maryland, and it did look at on-farm solar and some of the potential, what it means for farm and farm viability. So that should be coming out in October. You can find it on their website, and we will also host it on our website, which is solargrazing.org. That was the main one. And the rest of our events are through, you can find everything through solargrazing.org. And I encourage people to join. I think reasonable fees, and it all goes to support itself right now. So, and we're also going to be launching another few research projects that that farmer members can participate in. So, all right, that's what I'll say for now.
Thank you so much. I think that both Jake and Lexi show some interesting opportunities for New Hampshire. So we've already got several good questions. Let's take a few minutes and pose some of those to both of you. First one would be for Lexi, which is, what's a typical lease term for solar grazers? You mentioned long-term is better, so maybe a range and why you see long-term and what is long-term as a better option.
Oh, certainly. For farmers looking to try this form of targeted grazing, I would say at the minimum you want a 1-year contract to start. And also starting with a pilot project with a developer can be a nice way to start, where everyone's getting their feet wet together. But longer term, in terms of planning purposes, I think it'd be great to see 3 or 5 year at kind of as like a better standard. I know for my sake, things like putting up all the interior fence year after year means I want to leave it over the winter. So that ideal situation in South America where they have a contract for 20 years. I'd like to see that too. And I'm looking for things, and this is definitely my ASGA hat, where there are incentives for solar companies to have an ongoing relationship with the agricultural community and to see these sites managed this way.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Next one. So this might be for Jake and Lexi, talking about a loss in sunlight and really leading to reduction in grazing productivity. What is that percentage? It's something that I know is sort of being investigated now in terms of research, but in terms of Jake, your experience, or Lexi, your experience about sort of productivity reduction underneath the panels.
I'm actually can I share a link as well, Emily? So yeah, one thing
throw it in the chat. Yep.
In the chat. So one thing I'll put in the chat is a link to, there's a research institute in Germany that's done work on different agrivoltaic co-location. And one item that was in here was like clover, which did show a reduction in their trials. On the other hand, we can go to our website on the research model. In drier conditions, Oregon State University did a trial that showed increased productivity of all the grasses by up to 90%. And I know that in Australia has also had similar results of increased productivity in the panels. So I would say this is something where, like, I definitely see, and it really depends on the solar. Not all the ground, there's a wide array of different kinds of ground mounted solar being built. So I don't know that you can universally like decide that there's a % loss. But probably as this all evolves over the next few years, there will start to be those differentiations. But I certainly see different ecological zones and different plant communities evolving over the years at the solar sites that I manage, for certain. And that's actually very handy, but by the time it's August, because you might have the plants that are getting, there's a little more moisture retention under the panels, and you might have just some regrowth and then like a reserve, I think of it as, for my flock. So it can be an opportunity as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Jake, do you have any experience with that? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Absolutely. So we're actually partnered with UMass Amherst. Our first pilot project that was installed in South Deerfield is a part of a 6-year study that's actually growing 4 different vegetable crops underneath it, and to varying levels of success. So those 4 crops are green bell peppers, Swiss chard, broccoli, and kale. And in the drier years, they've had actually the control group, which is indirect sunlight, compared to the variable group. The variable group on those drier years has actually had increased productivity across the board. So 2016, for example, was a drought year here in Western Mass. And this year, I'm really interested to see what the data is, because it's been a serious drought here. Typically, what the loss is for those crops is about 20 to 30% of overall yield. And that's a dry weight comparison, dry weight and wet weight comparison.
Great, thank you. I think one more quick question, and if we have time, we'll try another one after that. I know we need to have time to wrap up. Jake, so in terms of sizing for some of these smaller arrays, could you give everyone here a little bit of an estimate, say if it's for on-farm use, maybe what the acreage would be if it were traditional or dual use?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of tricky, because all farms are of course, using different amounts of energy behind the meter. But for a standard amount, say 1 acre of traditionally installed solar might produce 200 to 250 kW DC. And spacing it out for the dual use installation method, that 1 acre might produce about between 50% and 75% of that. So looking at 125 kW to a maximum of 150 kW DC on 1 acre of land. And so if you scale that to say 1 megawatt of traditional power might fit onto 5 acres, and 1 megawatt of dual use might be about 8 or 9 acres.
Great. So there's another question that I'm going to turn into and ask so that we can move forward. Lexi, if you have any ready-made outreach materials that can be shared with land trusts, that would be something that I think our attendees would appreciate. You can send to me or put in the chat if you have them ready, and we can disseminate them.
They can, just quickly, if they go to our website and you click on information and on research, a bunch of those things are downloadable PDFs, downloadable brochures, downloadable reports. So it's kind of already all set that way, if that's
perfect.
Cool.
That's
that
great.
way I don't flood people's inboxes too.
Just want to take a second and say thank you both to Jake and Lexi for opening our eyes to some of these options around solar and how we can integrate it with agriculture. And thank you to Alex and Madeline. And we're going to move forward for one last quick ask. And while you're thinking about this last question, Jamie can take it over for a few minutes to wrap up. But if you could take a moment, think about what's one concrete step you can take after this to move forward both farmland protection and solar siting policy efforts. What might that be? Maybe it's just learning more, maybe it's spreading the word. But go ahead and just write that into the chat if you don't mind, and then I will pass this back to Jamie.
Great, thanks so much, Emily, and thanks to all of you. I was riveted the whole time. It was a really incredible presentation. So yeah, please do put your stuff in the chat. We'll summarize that in just a moment, but I will try to just wrap up with our last few slides here. So if you could go to the next one, Megan. Yeah, so just to note again, the last 2 workshops in this 5-part series, these are the ones for New Hampshire coming up on the 15th, strategies and tools for making farmland available to farmers, followed by tools and resources for supporting Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color in your community. And Steph Morningstar, our partner on this, who's still here on the call, Steph is going to be leading that one. So we really encourage you all to come back. Please do register if you haven't done that yet, and encourage all of your colleagues to do the same. The next slide, you want to take this one, Em?
Sure. On the left-hand side, you'll see the Smart Solar Setting for New England webinar series. This is the end of the 2-year project that I spoke about at the beginning of this workshop. There is a link to register. This is open, there's no cap. Please share far and wide, but it is really sort of focused on policy steps and those directly involved with farmland, state, muni levels, land conservation. But we appreciate anybody that would like to come and join, so please take a look. So in our chat for just a quick before we do the final thanks, it seems like there's a lot of folks interested in learning more about dual use and what some of these options are, and then significant interest in getting some good easement language involved in our land conservation organizations, our land trusts. That's great. And hopefully as we share these with everyone, there'll be an opportunity for you to look at the examples provided and learn how to incorporate it into your own easement language. So keep it up. Thanks so much. I'm going to pass this back to Jamie.
Great. And yes, we just want to kind of wrap up again by saying a really special thanks to all of our incredible speakers for being here with us today. Please, oh, I skipped. Sorry. Yes, we want to thank you for being here today. To all of you, Emily, Alex, I have that from yesterday, wrong ones. I'll read your name off of the slide. Emily, Lexi, Jake, Madeline, Alex, y'all were amazing. Next slide, please. This is just another quick request, and Megan, I do have the link here, so I'll paste it. This is, we're hoping all of you here on the call would be willing to just very briefly fill out a 5-minute or less survey about how you like this workshop, what your next steps are, any feedback for us to improve this for the future. I just pasted the link there. If you could just pop it up and have it open in your browser, so you could just maybe do it right after you sign off of here. We'll also email it sometime today or tomorrow in our sort of thank you email feedback to all of you, but just want to put that request out there that we'd really appreciate you doing that. And then on my actual last slide, just want to say again, thank you to everybody for being here with us today. It's exactly 3:30, so we did it right on time. Go team. And just to invite you to please feel free to follow up with myself, with Emily, with any of the speakers who are here on the call today. We'll just be so thrilled to hear from you, and we hope you really got a lot out of today, as I definitely did. And we hope to see you next week at the Making Farmland Available for Farmers workshop. This one's actually on the 15th, so the week after next. And have a great day, everybody. Thank you again so much, and be well.
Thank you, everybody.